Hello and welcome to Shakespeare's History Plays, Getting Our Historical Bearings. So, as we are entering into the History Plays portion of the class, I think it's time for us to delve in a little bit to the historical context, the social context, and also some of the different elements of history and history plays, particularly as relates to Shakespeare, so that it makes the reading a little bit more enjoyable and easy to understand. So, first and foremost, Shakespeare wrote 10 plays about English kings. These are known as the English history plays, from John to Henry VIII. And these are known as the English history plays, as I just said. He also wrote several plays based upon Roman history. The most famous of these are Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, and these are often termed the Roman history plays, even though they're usually grouped with the tragedies. We've also got another grouping when it comes to Shakespeare's history plays, and they are called the first and second tetralogies. The first folio list of plays divides the histories into two groups of four, and those are often commonly referred to as the tetralogies, a group of four related literary or operatic works. They're also known as a series of four ancient Greek dramas, three tragedies, and one satire play that are originally presented together. And they often deal with consecutive events. And that's exactly what happens with Shakespeare's two tetralogies. So the first tetralogy are the three parts of Henry VI and Richard III. And then the second tetralogy is Richard II, the two parts of Henry IV and Henry V. When we get to the history, so there's different themes, right? We've got the English history plays reflect the nationalism of England, particularly under Queen Elizabeth. And you'll notice that the plays point to an English sense of epic destiny, the moral complexities of getting and holding on to sovereign power. This is something that comes from a Norton Anthology English literature book that's pretty spot on in terms of what Shakespeare is doing and can get to, and what he highlights in a number of his plays. The Roman histories reflect the Renaissance, admiration of classical Greece and Rome, and the taste for the classical. This includes Greek and Latin learning. And I think you'll see that playing through too. When we think about Shakespeare's audience, the Renaissance time audience, there's an audience for both Roman and English history plays during Shakespeare's time because of the humanists that felt that contemporary, and at that time contemporary society was 16th century, that felt that contemporary 16th century England had inherited the torch from classical antiquity. You know, nationalism is rife with England, and so they see themselves in a very grandiose way, right? For English humanists, Elizabeth's England was the rebirth, a renaissance of sorts, of the glories of the Roman Empire. And so this connection back to Roman and Greek mythology, ideas, history, really sort of classic antiquity, really sort of connected to this, to Shakespeare's contemporaries. And then in the 16th century, as we know, it was a time of great global exploration, conquest, and colonization. Those terms would be used differently depending upon who's exploring and who's being colonized, right? But we in the 2020s America see that exploration and that conquesting was more about colonizing. But it's during a time which Britain strove to expand its empire into the New World or worlds. And these are themes that are dealt with in a number of Shakespeare's plays, not only the histories, but even to some extent the tragedies, and some of the romances, and not as much the comedies, but the others it's certainly happening there. So as we've talked about a few different times, Shakespeare pulls from different sources, much like contemporary authors. And so Raphael Holinshed was the primary author and editor of a work called The Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and it was published first in 1577 and revised in 1587. And Holinshed's work was a comprehensive historical record of events which shaped the development of Great Britain from pre-Christian times to the Tudor era, in which Shakespeare was writing. Holinshed's work is the principal source for more than a dozen of Shakespeare's plays, and as such, the chronicles have been scrutinized for any clues which might provide some insight into Shakespeare's artistic method and his political philosophy. In addition, Shakespeare really pulls from Plutarch as a source for his Roman history plays. And Plutarch is a Greek historian, biographer, and essayist in 46 AD to 120 AD, and he's credited as having written Lives of the Noble Grecians and Romans compared together. Plutarch's work remains the primary source for Shakespeare's Roman history plays, and Shakespeare would have used the translation made by Sir Thomas North in 1579, which he would have studied as a student in grammar school. The textual similarities between Plutarch and Shakespeare are so abundant and definitive that it would be difficult to disprove this association between the two authors. For additional sources, Shakespeare drew on the following: the anonymous history play, The Famous Victories of Henry V, Hall's The Union of the Noble and Illustrious Families of Lancaster and York, Edward Hall's Historical Chronicles, John Fox's Book of Martyrs is a source for Act 5 in Henry VIII. In its manuscript form, not published until 1641, George Cavendish's negotiations of Cardinal Wolsey may have been an indirect source. And these are just to name a few of the other primary sources that Shakespeare pulls from. Now, even though Shakespeare is pulling from some of these historical works of literature and scholars, he's also providing his own alternative history. Once again, before the term was even coined, Shakespeare is engaging in the practice of writing alternative histories. Now, alternative history is defined by Merriam-Webster as, quote, the fiction that is based on history and that explores what might have happened if certain historical events, figures, etc. had been different, end quote. A second definition states, quote, a history that is told from an unusual or unorthodox perspective, end quote. I think you'll find that in Shakespeare's approach to his history plays that he does a little bit of both in his storytelling. The key to alternative histories is what's called the point of divergence, the moment when imagination takes over from reality, or at least from recorded history. It's worth noting that histories are often codified by the victors, so reality, quote unquote, can be from a skewed perspective. Historians do their best to verify facts and use primary sources to confirm historical truths, but some histories and history books certainly leave out the broad experience of all people involved, typically the marginalized and oppressed, or, in terms of colonization, the conquered. And sometimes, even in the U.S., the historians, the history books, provide a more nationalistic or whitewashed view of historical events. And I use whitewashed with different puns and different meanings in mind. As the imaginative individual he was, Shakespeare did more than simply regurgitate or reiterate ideas from sources upon which he drew. In fact, Shakespeare made many alterations to both Holinshed's and Plutarch's accounts, including those that changed the narration into a more dramatic stage format, and also in ways that transcend both Holinshed, Plutarch, and the theater in order to reveal his own twists on the historical accounts. With this ability to dramatize history, Shakespeare reveals his own understanding and knowledge of English and Roman history. It makes one wonder if, like so many critical thinkers, that Shakespeare found value in understanding the past so as to learn and grow from it in order to avoid repeating similar mistakes. Through his focus on particular and focused moments in the historical characters' lives and histories, Shakespeare exemplifies how he was and remains an intellectual and imaginative innovator. It's also worth pondering how Shakespeare might be responding to the historical accounts to which he was privy in his plays, and what commentary or arguments he might be offering in his telling of the historical people and events. Do you see Shakespeare as an author who not only wanted to entertain, but also intellectually stimulate his audience? Do you think he has a lofty goal of using his art to effect positive change? I look forward to learning your thoughts on those questions and your answers. So I think in order to continue to get our historical bearings, it's good for us to understand how British royalty and other areas of royalty and the titles used work, so that we can make greater sense of who's who, what their roles are, and how they relate to each other within each of the plays. I think it's also really important understanding the great chain of being, Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and their perspective about order and hierarchy, and how strictly they adhere to hierarchical structures and ideologies for society. So this is the list that we're going to spend a little time getting a little bit more into. So the queen or king is the head of state. The queen, a consort, is the spouse of a ruling queen or king, and a consort has no constitutional power, but supports her, their spouse in their duties as sovereign. A queen consort is the wife of a reigning king, and usually shares the spouse's social rank and status. A queen consort, however, cannot become a queen. The queen consort title is acquired through marriage, but the title and role of a reigning monarch can only be inherited. Queen consorts are often called queen and followed by their name, but they aren't actually ruling queens. A prince consort is not called a king consort, but a prince consort, is the husband of a reigning female sovereign who himself is a prince or is given the title of prince. It's the ruling queen's husband. It does not have the title king because of British royal tradition, whereby a man marrying into the royal family does not assume the male title that's held by his wife. They often get these other titles like prince. Unlike royal women, who would be called queen consorts, the husbands in monarchy do not take the title of king. The husbands to a monarch do not take the title of a king for two reasons. One, the title of king can only be inherited, and two, because a king always outranks a queen. Overall, the spouse of a monarch cannot become a monarch themselves. This distinction is important to keep in mind when reading history plays like Richard III, where the ruling monarch dies and the queen consort has to secure the line of succession for her children. Even though France observed an ancient law against the succession of women, England was a bit more progressive and has never observed such a law. Therefore, Queen Elizabeth I, Shakespeare's first patron, and her sister Mary I were crowned queens in their own rights. By the late 18th century, a British queen could marry and choose not to have her consort crowned. So we've talked about Queen Elizabeth choosing not to marry because she didn't want, Queen Elizabeth I, I'm sorry, not to marry because she didn't want her spouse to become king and eclipse her and her rule and her authority as the rightful heir to the throne. But by the 18th century, the queens could marry and choose not to have her consort crowned. So Queen Anne and Queen Victoria and the late Queen Elizabeth II observed this practice. Conversely, many queen consorts have been crowned in coronation services, even though the husbands of queens were not crowned. So I want you to consider the implications of patriarchy and sexism, as well as the perception of power and authority that might be in play here as queens decide how to move forward with their husbands. How might some of this knowledge of these titles influence Shakespeare's stories? As a side note, how about the fact that Romans could not marry foreigners? So if Antony and Cleopatra did have a ceremony and a marriage in Egypt, Rome would not have seen their marriage as valid, even if they did. In terms of British succession and familial ties, monarchy was hereditary. On the death of a monarch, the crown passes to the eldest male child. If there are no legitimate male heirs, the daughter can succeed, as we have seen with the previous queens that I've mentioned. Children of monarchs are styled royal princes and princesses, and immediate relatives of the king and queen, such as brothers and sisters, are styled as royal dukes and duchesses. Please notice how these titles are so explicitly gendered. What happens if a non-binary monarch who does not identify as female or male takes the throne? Does the current monarchy need to update their practices, perhaps? When we get to nobles, it's much more inclusive because nobles are not exclusively of royal blood, but those who can trace their lineage to royal blood have a little more clout and certainly a little more pride. The following titles are maintained by nobles: dukes, marquesses, the English spelling, earls, viscounts, and barons. Those carrying these titles ruled areas of the country in the form of fiefdoms. The power of nobility ebbed and flowed according to the strength or weakness of the ruling monarch, and nobles were beholden to the monarchy, for the queen or king retained the power to remove nobles' lands and titles for lack of loyalty or obedience to the crown. Titles were reassigned when taken from another as punishment or when the family line died out. Depending on the monarch, this could look like a revolving door with people losing and gaining titles. Things to think about regarding Shakespeare's plays are things that we see titles redistributed as punishment and because of death in many of the tragedies and histories. With the monarch's ability to bestow and remove titles and accompanying lands on a whim, do the titles lose their meaning? Do titles become a form of control to subjugate, manipulate, or even coerce people to do the monarch's will? What commentary or arguments do you think Shakespeare offers through the storytelling in his plays as it relates to titles and nobility and monarchy? In terms of inheritance, only a handful were permitted to hold titles through right of primogeniture, the right of succession belonging to the firstborn child, especially the feudal rule by which the whole real estate of an intestate or not having made a will before one dies passes to the eldest child. Inheritance injustice. Women held very few rights of inheritance. Typically, if a woman was the sole heir, her father's titles and land devolved to her husband or to some distant male relative. So we can see that the inequities with inheritance are a direct result of patriarchal rule. When we get to gentlemen, we have knights and esquires. These are the titles conferred by the monarch on ordinary people for outstanding achievements and services to their country. Shakespeare acquired the title of esquire for his father, and he inherited that title after his father's death. Therefore, Shakespeare had the right to style himself a gentleman. In 1596, when Shakespeare acquired the title and related coat of arms, England was enjoying an increase in social mobility. The coat of arms was an essential symbol of respectability and was highly sought after. It was estimated that William Shakespeare might have paid as much as £20 for his coat of arms and title. Thus, only the wealthy could purchase their way into the gentry if they were not born into it. Between 1570 and 1630, there were 45 gentlemen in Stratford-upon-Avon out of a population of around 2,200 in 1595. 28 had been born into the title, and the other 17 were tradesmen who, like Shakespeare, successfully applied for and earned the status. The motto on Shakespeare's coat of arms reads, and I butcher French all the time, I try my hardest, but I'm sorry, non sans droit, which is an old French and translates to not without right. And there's a description, a grant description where the coat of arms is described in detail. And on the last slide of this presentation, you'll see a common rendition of, an artist's rendition of what that description would look like. When we get to continental titles, we have the title of Count is used only in continental Europe, and Countess. In France, the heir to the throne is the oldest son is called the Dauphin, and the Dauphine is the title of the wife of a Dauphin. The Holy Roman Emperor ruler is the ruler and head of state of the Holy Roman Empire. Francis II was the last Holy Roman Emperor who dissolved the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. And the Pope alone can confer the title of Holy Roman Emperor, and only with his blessing can it be inherited. The reason I'm going to get into a little bit of the who's who in the Catholic Church is because in some of the history and tragedy plays, Shakespeare speaks of different religious leaders, and so it's nice to have a little bit of grounding into the who's who. So the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, the Supreme Pontiff, the leader of the worldwide Catholic Church. The Cardinal is a senior ecclesiastical leader and a prince of the Church. And these are in order from the highest, the hierarchical order within the Catholic Church, with the Pope being the highest. Then you've got the Archbishop, which is a particularly important bishop overseeing large areas of churches called archdioceses. The bishop is an ordained minister who holds the full sacrament of holy orders and teaches doctrine. A priest is similar to the bishops in being part of the ministerial order of the Catholic Church. A priest offers the Eucharist, hears confessions, and offers counseling. They also lead daily prayers. An abbot is the head of a monastery or abbey. A monk remains in a monastery and serves the church within the monastery's boundaries. A friar serves in society and serves the church in different populated areas. Abbots, monks, and friars may or may not be ordained priests. And it's important to keep these titles in mind as we read through some of the histories. And what's sort of fascinating too is this any man, rich or poor, could join a monastery or be ordained a priest and even become pope. And any woman could become a nun, but promotion beyond the abbey or nunnery was not accepted. Go figure, patriarchy rules again. And so here's the coat of arms that Shakespeare was able to, how we imagine it looks like. And I hope that this quick overview of the historical titles, bearings helps you as you approach the different plays. So please continue to ponder how history informs the present as you read on. Enjoy!